Hello everyone, Nathan here, and about a year ago, I made a video complaining about some of the bloating we see in modern games, where there often seems to be content purely for the sake of content. It's the type of content that doesn't actually add anything to the game, it's just there to keep you playing longer and sound good for marketing. Since I said that though, there seems to have been a trend to the exact polar opposite, where full-on AAA games are releasing more and more regularly with way less content than they used to. So today I'll be taking a look at whether or not I was wrong about game bloating, and whether it's okay for new games to have less content than older ones. Now, as I said, there are plenty of games stripping content these days, but to demonstrate the point, I'm going to need a case study, a game or game series that really shows off the issue here. To do that, I'm going to be taking a look at the differences and similarities between Battlefield 4 and Battlefield 1, and more specifically we're going to be looking at the guns in those games. So, Battlefield 4 is a game that came out in 2013, and has since had new guns, maps and gadgets added into it, both through paid and free DLC. And as of right now, and probably forevermore, because they're not really going to make more content for this one, the game has 89 different primary weapons that you can choose from. That's not including any pistols or weapons that are counted as gadgets either, just the main guns that you can pick from. Now, since we're going to be comparing this with Battlefield 1, which hasn't really had any proper DLC come out for it yet, I'll take all the DLC guns out of the equation so that we can get a fair comparison between the two. And that leaves us with 72 primary weapons that Battlefield 4 launched with. Now for me, in the past I've said that's too much, and we'll discuss a little bit about why in a minute, but first let's have a look at what Battlefield 1 launched with. Now, the vanilla version of Battlefield 1 has 64 primary weapons, which breaks down into 16 for each of the 4 classes. You might think that doesn't sound too bad. I mean, Battlefield 4 had 72, and that means there's only 8 fewer guns. And sure, that's still less, but not by much, and you might not really care. In reality though, there are 3 different variants of all but 4 of the guns in the game, so a massive percentage of those 64 guns are just copies with slightly different scopes or stats. When you account for that, the actual number for unique primary weapons in Battlefield 1 is only 24. Now, we have a situation where a new game has launched with 48 fewer guns than its predecessor, and the question is that okay? Or even, is that better in some ways? Well, that lack of guns could be seen as a lack of variety, and that's the kind of thing that's going to affect a product's lifespan. If we look at Battlefield 4, that's a 3-year-old game that you can still find servers to play in right now. You can still find a fully populated match without any problem. Sure, it may not be the exact map or game mode that you want to play, but there's actually a surprising amount of choice, and at least from my own point of view, what's kept me going back and playing every now and again is the abundance of different guns and attachments to choose from. Oh, and by the way, Battlefield 4 has way more customization for each weapon, meaning that you can make the same gun feel completely different from game to game. Now compare that with Battlefield 1, which does seem to have been losing player count at a steady rate since its launch. To a certain extent that is to be expected, and it's certainly not difficult to get a match in BF1, but hardcore players have already unlocked everything in the game, and I'd say they've probably done it within a month or two of the game's release. And while player count certainly isn't too much of a worry right now, going forward it could well struggle more than Battlefield 4 has. You could make the excuse though that there's a far more restricted pool of weapons to choose from in a World War I setting, as opposed to the Modern Warfare setting that Battlefield 4 had, and maybe you could say that DICE have been restricted by that. But from a gameplay stance, that doesn't really make a difference. Maybe it makes it more understandable why those guns aren't in the game, but it doesn't make up for them not being there. And besides, some of the guns and gadgets that have been added into the game are incredibly outlandish and never actually saw service. So on that basis, I think they could have added far more into the game, and honestly right now, I often feel like playing Battlefield 4 more than Battlefield 1, because I can try so many more styles of play with different guns, scopes, barrels and grips. So you might think then from what I've been saying that more content is always better. But like I said at the start, I've actually criticised Battlefield 4 in the past for having too many guns, and that's because of 2 things which sort of have a bit of crossover with each other. Firstly, the balance of the game, which is almost impossible to get right with 89 different guns. To try and give every gun a chance and make them competitive in their own situations will never happen when you have that many variables to take into account, and you might have noticed in the footage playing in the background here, that there's a lot of players running around with the AEK assault rifle, because it's pretty much objectively better than almost every other gun in the game. And at the other end of the scale, there's guns like the U100 Mark V, which basically never gets used because it just can't compete. So that's a decent argument for having fewer guns in your game, right? I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who trade a bit of content in exchange for a better balanced game. Well, I think it would be a decent argument if the balance wasn't also pretty dodgy in Battlefield 1. Now, to my mind, it's not nearly as bad as Battlefield 4, but if you jump into an infantry-based mode, you'll find yourself getting killed by an Automatico over and over and over again, because it kills incredibly quickly and doesn't require a massive amount of skill. And as far as I'm concerned, if you still can't get your balance right with fewer guns in your game, I don't think that's a good reason to leave them out. So with balancing discounted from the argument, we move on to my other problem with too much content in a game, which is the idea of non-content. This is content that has been added into the game purely to make the experience longer. Now that's slightly easier to demonstrate in RPGs, where we see tedious quests that are just there to take up your time, and yeah, they show up in games like The Witcher 3 and Skyrim. But as we're looking at Battlefield guns, it translates into the guns that are just pointless. And sure, that could be because of balance, since if you add in another gun that isn't competitive, no one's going to use it. But for me, it's far worse when these are guns that are no different to other guns that are already in the game. Now that does rear its ugly head somewhat in Battlefield 4, but for the most part the guns have some kind of defining factor that differentiates them from the other guns in the game, whether it's rounds per minute, or recoil, or whatever it is. It all seems to pale in comparison to Battlefield 1's non-content, since, as I mentioned earlier, there are 3 different variants of most guns, some of which change such minor things like which sight a gun has, or slightly faster reload time. So personally, I don't think you can use the argument that at least in Battlefield 1, all the content is meaningful, because for me, it just isn't. Now, of course, there is more to content than just guns, such as maps, skins and classes, and I really don't want you to think that I'm bashing Battlefield 1, because I actually really enjoy the game, even with all its faults. I mean, I wouldn't have put around 50 hours into a game I hated. It just so happens that even though a lot of other games are releasing with less content, Battlefield 1 is possibly the best example I could think of, and when your first-person shooter doesn't have enough guns, it's a bit of an issue. And with Battlefield 1 having the business model that it does, where new guns and maps are locked behind a paywall, it seems unlikely that players will get the extra content needed to make this game a more complete experience, without sinking in even more of their hard-earned cash on top of the £50 or $60 that they spent on the game in the first place. I sincerely hope that these DLC guns do become available through in-game currency that can be earned without spending real money, even if it does take a long time to get them. Honestly though, I find that very unlikely, given EA's history and the information that's already been given about what's coming up with the game's £40 premium pass. So to come to some kind of conclusion here, I think that there are reasonable arguments for having less content in a game, and I genuinely believe that some games would be better if they were shorter, less cluttered experiences. But there's a balance to be struck. Less content isn't always bad, but taking it away to the extent where your game isn't interesting and varied enough to keep players engaged, particularly in a multiplayer game, is not what I want to see. And in the case of Battlefield 1, I feel that there should have been more guns in the game at launch. That's not to say that I think the amount of content in a game is the most important aspect though, and the quality of the gameplay will always be the main priority for me. More content though, so long as it's meaningful, will keep me interested in that gameplay longer and keep me playing, and even though I enjoy Battlefield 1, I don't feel any real desire to play that much more now, because I feel like I've experienced almost everything the game has to offer. So that's about it for today, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, I'd be very appreciative if you'd click that like button down below, let me know what you think about this in the comments, and subscribe for more like this if you haven't already. Now if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go do my work on the slowest computer known to man, because my brand new beast of a PC isn't working. Hopefully it'll be fixed soon and I can bring you some absolutely beautiful looking gameplay at ultra settings at higher resolutions, but until then, I've been Nathan, thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.